Katie's decision to launch her own fashion house arrived not as a quiet experiment, but as a thunderclap that rippled through every corner of the Forrester universe. Backed by Bill's unmistakable financial power and unveiled with strategic confidence, the brand's debut commanded attention before a single garment even reached the runway. Industry insiders whispered, social media buzzed, and the unspoken question hung heavily in the air: was this a genuine creative force, or a provocation designed to challenge the very heart of Forrester Creations? For Katie, the answer was deeply personal. This was not about rivalry for its own sake, nor about proving loyalty to Bill. It was about stepping out of the shadows cast by stronger personalities, and claiming an identity forged by her own instincts, her own taste, her own resilience. Brooke watched the launch unfold with a conflicted expression she could not entirely mask. She admired Katie's courage, and understood the hunger to be seen as more than a supporting character in someone else's story. Yet admiration was tempered by realism, shaped by decades of watching fashion dreams rise and collapse under the weight of market brutality. Brooke's skepticism was not rooted in malice, but in experience. She had seen how unforgiving the industry could be, how even brilliance could be crushed without the right infrastructure, legacy, and creative momentum. Bill's money could open doors, yes, but money alone could not guarantee longevity in a world where trends shifted like sand and reputations were built over lifetimes. Unable to contain her concerns, Brooke confided in Donna during a quiet moment that she assumed would remain private. She spoke candidly, expressing fear that Katie was being set up for disappointment, that Bill's involvement might invite scrutiny as much as support. Brooke worried that the new house would be judged not on its merits, but as a challenge to Forrester Creations, forcing comparisons that could damage everyone involved. Her words were measured, even compassionate, yet carried an unmistakable doubt about the brand's ability to endure. What Brooke did not realize was that Ridge, passing through the adjacent space, caught enough of the conversation to understand its implication. The tension ignited instantly, sharp and personal, cutting deeper, because it touched the core of his identity. Ridge's reaction was immediate and visceral. To him, Forrester Creations was not merely a business, it was a legacy built by generations, an extension of his family's bloodline and creative soul. The idea that another fashion house, especially one funded by Bill, might be perceived as a legitimate rival felt like an affront. Ridge confronted Brooke with a fury that surprised even himself, defending Forrester's dominance with the conviction of someone who believed history itself stood on his side. He argued that no new brand, regardless of financial backing, could replicate the influence, artistry, and heritage that Forrester represented. His words carried the weight of pride and fear intertwined, revealing how deeply he equated the company's status with his own sense of worth. Brooke refused to retreat. She countered Ridge's certainty with a reminder that the fashion world was not governed by sentiment alone. Legacy mattered, but innovation and resources mattered too, and Bill possessed the latter in abundance. Brooke challenged Ridge's tendency to elevate Forrester Creations to untouchable status, suggesting that such arrogance could blind him to real competition. She insisted that acknowledging Katie's potential did not diminish Forrester's greatness, but Ridge heard betrayal where Brooke intended realism. Their disagreement quickly shifted from professional speculation to personal allegiance, each word sharpening the divide between them. As the argument escalated, it became clear that this was not merely about fashion houses. It was about loyalty, identity, and the fault lines that had always existed beneath Brooke and Ridge's relationship. Ridge accused Brooke of siding with Bill's influence over her own marriage, of underestimating the very institution that had defined his life. Brooke fired back that Ridge's defensiveness revealed an unwillingness to see beyond his own legacy, that his dismissal of Katie's ambition reflected a deeper insecurity. The clash exposed how easily love between them could fracture when family and pride collided. Caught at the center of this storm, Katie felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. She had never intended for her pursuit of independence to jeopardize her sister's marriage. The guilt gnawed at her, especially as she witnessed the strain between Brooke and Ridge deepen. Yet retreating now felt impossible. To step back would be to confirm every doubt cast upon her, to reduce her dream to collateral damage in someone else's conflict. Katie resolved to press forward, determined to prove that her vision was not a threat born of rivalry, but a testament to her own capability. The competition between Katie's fashion house and Forrester Creations intensified with each passing week. Runway shows, marketing campaigns, and strategic hires turned the industry into a battleground where every success or misstep was magnified by personal history. Each headline felt like a verdict, each comparison a spark. Ridge interpreted any praise for Katie's brand as a direct challenge, while Brooke saw the coverage as validation that new voices could coexist with established giants. Their conversations became increasingly charged, laced with frustration and exhaustion. Arguments spilled from boardrooms into their home, eroding the intimacy they had struggled so hard to rebuild. Disagreements that once might have been resolved with compromise now hardened into standoffs. Ridge accused Brooke of undermining him publicly by questioning Forrester's dominance, while Brooke accused Ridge of allowing pride to overshadow empathy. Neither felt fully heard, each retreating into defensive positions that widened the emotional gap between them. Katie, watching from the periphery, pushed herself harder than ever. She worked relentlessly, refining designs, cultivating partnerships, and asserting her presence with quiet tenacity. Every success felt bittersweet, shadowed by the knowledge that her progress deepened the rift between Brooke and Ridge. Yet she refused to let guilt derail her momentum. This was her chance to redefine herself, to exist not as someone's sister or someone's former wife, but as a creator in her own right. The strain on Brooke and Ridge reached a breaking point, when yet another public comparison placed Katie's brand alongside Forrester Creations as a rising force. Ridge's anger erupted, fueled by the perception that his life's work was being trivialized. Brooke, weary of constant conflict, confronted the reality that their marriage was once again teetering on the edge. They were no longer arguing about strategy or loyalty, they were questioning whether their fundamental values could coexist. In the quiet aftermath of their fiercest confrontation, both were forced to reckon with uncomfortable truths. Ridge had to confront the possibility that his identity was too tightly bound to Forrester Creations, that any perceived threat felt existential rather than professional. Brooke had to face the reality that her pragmatism, however justified, could feel like betrayal to someone who lived and breathed legacy. Love, they realized, was not enough if it could not bridge such deeply ingrained differences. As whispers of separation grew louder, the question of divorce loomed, heavy and unavoidable. Brooke and Ridge stood at a crossroads that demanded more than passion or nostalgia. It required a choice about what they were willing to sacrifice: pride, control, certainty, to preserve a future together. Katie's fashion house continued to rise, indifferent to the emotional wreckage it inadvertently inspired, a symbol of independence forged in conflict. Whether Brooke and Ridge could navigate this divide remained uncertain. Their story, once defined by dramatic reunions and impulsive declarations, now demanded introspection and restraint. The rivalry between fashion houses had exposed the fragility of their bond, forcing them to confront whether love could survive when allegiance pulled them in opposite directions. In the end, the question was no longer who would win the fashion war, but whether Brooke and Ridge could redefine partnership in a world where ambition and legacy refused to remain separate. The silence that followed their last argument did not bring relief. It settled over Brooke and Ridge like a dense fog, heavy with everything neither of them had been willing to say aloud. The house that once felt like a refuge now seemed to echo with unresolved tension, every familiar room reminding them of how many times they had stood at similar crossroads before, swearing that this time would be different. Yet this time felt colder, more calculated, stripped of the impulsive passion that had once fueled their reconciliations. What frightened Brooke most was not Ridge's anger, but his certainty, the way he clung to Forrester Creations as if it were the final, immovable truth in his life. What unsettled Ridge was not Brooke's skepticism, but her refusal to retreat from it, her insistence on seeing the world as it was rather than as he needed it to be. As days passed, the rift widened quietly. They continued to appear together when necessary, their public faces polished and controlled, but behind closed doors their conversations were clipped, transactional, careful. Every discussion risked circling back to the same fault line: loyalty versus realism, legacy versus evolution. Ridge immersed himself deeper into work, tightening his grip on Forrester Creations, as if defending the company could somehow stabilize his marriage. He approved designs more aggressively, pushed for bolder statements, determined to remind the industry, and himself, that Forrester remained untouchable. Yet beneath that drive simmered a persistent fear that no amount of creative dominance could protect him from the possibility of losing Brooke. Brooke, meanwhile, found herself retreating emotionally in a way that felt unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. She had always been the one to fight, to plead, to chase reconciliation even when logic suggested walking away. Now, exhaustion dulled that instinct. Years of loving Ridge had taught her how easily passion could become weaponized, how quickly devotion could be turned into leverage. She still loved him, profoundly and irrevocably, but love no longer felt like sufficient justification for sacrificing her own clarity. Watching Katie navigate her new venture with determination and quiet confidence only sharpened Brooke's awareness of her own internal shift. She began to wonder whether standing her ground was not an act of betrayal, but of survival. Katie sensed the change immediately. She saw it in Brooke's guarded demeanor, in the way Ridge's name carried new weight when spoken aloud. The guilt she had been carrying intensified, twisting into something heavier, as she realized that her success was no longer an abstract threat, but a tangible wedge between two people she loved deeply. Yet the more pressure mounted, the more resolute she became. Every instinct told her that stepping aside now would only reinforce the narrative, that she was incapable of standing on her own without causing damage. She refused to let her dream be defined by other people's marriages, even as she mourned the cost. The fashion world, indifferent to personal anguish, continued to reward momentum. Katie's brand gained traction not because it challenged Forrester directly, but because it offered something different: clean lines, restrained confidence, a quiet assurance that resonated with buyers fatigued by spectacle. The praise was not explosive but steady, the kind that suggested longevity rather than novelty. Ridge interpreted this as a direct threat, even as he publicly dismissed it. Each positive review felt like erosion, not of Forrester's market share, but of the certainty he had built his identity upon. The breaking point came not during a public confrontation, but in a moment of brutal honesty neither of them had planned. Late one evening, after another long day spent on opposite sides of the same industry battle, Brooke confronted Ridge with a question she had been avoiding for weeks. She asked him, plainly, whether there was room in his life for anything that did not orbit Forrester Creations. The question stunned him into silence. He wanted to deny it, to reassure her, but the truth lodged painfully in his throat. For the first time, Ridge had to confront the possibility that his devotion to legacy had become a barrier rather than a foundation. His hesitation was answer enough. Brooke felt something inside her settle, not with anger, but with a weary acceptance. She told him that she could not continue living in a marriage where her perspective was treated as opposition rather than partnership. She admitted that she feared becoming invisible again, reduced to someone expected to fall in line whenever his world felt threatened. Ridge responded defensively at first, accusing her of dramatizing a professional disagreement into a personal ultimatum. But even as the words left his mouth, he recognized the hollowness in them. This was no longer about fashion houses. It was about whether they could respect each other without demanding surrender. The possibility of divorce emerged not as a threat, but as a somber acknowledgement. Neither spoke it lightly. Both understood the weight of that word, the history attached to it, the way it had punctuated their lives with painful regularity. This time, however, the idea did not ignite chaos or desperation. It hung between them, heavy but measured, forcing a reckoning rather than a reaction. Ridge realized, with quiet dread, that Brooke might actually walk away this time, not because she loved him less, but because she loved herself more. Katie learned of this shift indirectly, through subtle changes rather than explicit confession. She noticed Brooke spending more time alone, Ridge arriving at work earlier and leaving later, the emotional distance no longer masked by forced optimism. The knowledge that her success had contributed to this moment was unbearable, yet it also clarified something essential. Katie finally understood that her responsibility was not to preserve other people's relationships, but to live truthfully within her own. That realization strengthened her resolve rather than weakening it. If Brooke and Ridge were to survive, it would have to be on terms that no longer relied on sacrifice disguised as loyalty. As the rivalry between the fashion houses reached its most intense phase, an unexpected shift occurred. Forrester Creations, driven by Ridge's urgency, produced some of its most daring work in years. The designs were brilliant, but they carried an edge of defiance that critics noted openly. Katie's brand, by contrast, continued its measured ascent, praised for consistency rather than aggression. The contrast between the two houses began to mirror the emotional states of their leaders, one fighting to prove dominance, the other building patiently toward self-definition. Brooke watched this unfold with growing clarity. She began to see that the conflict was not something she could mediate or soften. Ridge needed to confront his own fears, just as she needed to honor her own boundaries. Their love, once sustained by dramatic gestures and emotional extremes, now demanded something far more difficult: restraint, humility, and the willingness to evolve independently. Whether Ridge was capable of that evolution remained uncertain. The story does not resolve neatly. It fractures, recalibrates, and waits. Brooke and Ridge stand at a threshold where nostalgia can no longer carry them forward. Katie continues to rise, not as an antagonist, but as a catalyst for truths long suppressed. The question that lingers is no longer who will dominate the fashion world, but whether Brooke and Ridge can redefine love without domination at all. And in that unanswered question lies the true heart of the conflict, one that will shape not only their marriage, but the future of every legacy they hold dear.